Niger's presidential guard detained democratically elected President Mohamed Bazoum in an apparent coup d'etat, triggering a standoff with the army. President Volodymyr Zelensky reiterates his plans to reintegrate Crimea into Ukraine and warns Russian troops to leave while they still can. Supporters of Niger's President Mohamed Bazoum took to the streets of the capital Niamey on Wednesday, shouting "No coup d'etat" after members of the Presidential Guard detained the democratically elected leader, triggering a standoff with the army. Hours after the apparent coup, protesters tried to approach the presidential palace where Bazoum was being held, but dispersed when guards fired warning shots at the crowd. The African Union, France, the European Union and the US have all condemned the action and called for the release of the president and his family. Soldiers from Niger, claiming to represent defense and security forces, announced on national television they had overthrown the government, dissolved the constitution and closed the borders. Neighboring Benin's president is reportedly en route to mediate as a representative of the West African Economic Bloc, ECOWAS.
Même quand ce qui n'est pas acceptable se fait, il faut que, dans la paix, on puisse corriger cela. C'est notre première option. Nous pensons que ce sera avec succès.
President Bazoum is one of a dwindling group of pro-Western leaders in the Sahel region. He was elected 2 years ago in the nation's first peaceful democratic transfer of power since its independence from France in 1960. Bazoum has taken the helm of a country burdened by poverty and a history of chronic turmoil. Threats to his leadership could undermine the West's efforts to stabilize the region. In his nightly address to the nation, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said on Wednesday that he's optimistic about the progress his troops are making, 2 months into a counteroffensive that had initially stalled. Zelensky also had a message for the Crimean Peninsula, which was illegally annexed by Russia in 2014.
Готуємо і перелік деокупаційних кроків для Криму, комплексних, і безпекових, і економічних, і соціальних. Ми можемо доволі швидко реінтегрувати Крим в державну тканину України. Власне, вже зараз окупантам варто подумати там, у Криму, що поки Кримський міст ще хоч так-сяк працює, треба їм повертатись додому, в Росію.
So far, Ukraine's counteroffensive has managed to reclaim 192 square kilometers of territory at the cost of heavy casualties. Kyiv has also increased the number of attacks on the Crimean Peninsula, hitting the symbolic Kerch Bridge, which links the territory to Russia.
African leaders have been arriving in St. Petersburg ahead of a summit that Moscow hopes will boost its influence in the continent and win it more support in the context of the Ukraine war. But on the eve of the event, the number of attending heads of state had shrunk from 43 to 17, a drop that the Kremlin blamed on Western interference. The two-day conference comes in the wake of Russia pulling out of the Black Sea grain deal. President Vladimir Putin sought to reassure the leaders, including Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, whom he met separately, that Russia could send enough grain to compensate Africa for the loss of Ukrainian shipments. The fate of future contracts with the Wagner mercenary group is also likely to be discussed. The leaders of countries like Mali and Sudan rely on its military support, and after June's failed uprising, uncertainty remains over what role the private army will play in Africa.
During a historic visit to Vanuatu on Thursday, French President Emmanuel Macron has announced what he calls new imperialism in the Pacific. Macron, who is the first sitting French president to visit an independent Pacific island state, traveled to the small island nation as part of his 3-country tour meant to underscore his nation's role in the region, presenting a possible counter as China and the US compete for influence. Macron also reflected on his own country's colonial past in Vanuatu, saying the brutality of that period should not be forgotten.
An apocalyptic landscape rises over Rhodes, one of the Greek islands that has been fighting roaring wildfires day and night. Columns of smoke rise over the coastal town of Kiotari, practically empty after the evacuation of thousands of tourists. On Monday, the fire claimed 3 lives, 2 of them pilots fighting the flames. Strong winds and high temperatures form a dangerous cocktail that threatens the whole of southern Europe. In Croatia, a gigantic fire has broken out near the tourist town of Dubrovnik. The outbreak is more than 5 kilometers long, and more than 130 firefighters are battling the blaze. Fires also mark the news in Sicily. A large forest fire is approaching Palermo, whose airport remained closed this morning after flames reached its perimeter. At least 120 families have been evacuated, and in one town, part of the local landfill is burning. In Portugal, the main setting for the fight against the fire is Sintra Cascais Natural Park west of Lisbon. The flames caught on quickly yesterday afternoon and forced the evacuation of dozens of people. More than 500 firefighters were still on the ground this Wednesday to prevent the flames from returning. In Spain, attention is focused on the flames that broke out on Tuesday in Gran Canaria and forced evacuations of dozens of people. As of Wednesday morning, rescue workers say the situation does appear to be under control.
Indonesian rescuers are in a race against the clock to save 8 people trapped in an illegal gold mine on Java, the country's biggest island. Local police say the miners were digging inside a 60-meter deep hole when it was suddenly flooded. The country's military is helping rescue efforts and trying to pump water from the mine as oxygen is quickly running out. Unlicensed mines are common across the mineral-rich country, and many are built with complete disregard for even the most basic safety measures.
Sinead O'Connor, the gifted Irish singer-songwriter who became a superstar in her mid-20s, has died at the age of 56. A cover of Prince's ballad, Nothing Compares to You, was the song that changed her life. A seething, shattering performance that topped the charts from Europe to Australia and was heightened by a promotional video featuring the grey-eyed O'Connor in intense close-up. Her career was known as much for her mental health struggles and provocative actions as for her fierce and expressive music.
The United States Federal Reserve has raised interest rates to a 22-year high as it continues its fight against rising inflation. The decision to increase rates by a quarter percentage point to a range of 5.25 to 5.5% comes after the Fed paused its rate-rising cycle last month. It marks the 11th increase since early 2022, when the Fed started raising borrowing costs to try to cool the economy and to ease rising prices.
Restoring price stability is essential to set the stage for achieving maximum employment and stable prices over the longer run. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals.
The U.S. economy has remained robust despite the 11 rate rises the Fed has now implemented, its most aggressive rate-rising cycle in 40 years. Hiring has slowed but remains strong, and the unemployment rate is still close to a record low. The Fed's hike comes ahead of a similar meeting of the European Central Bank, which is under pressure to signal an end to interest rate rises. Eurozone banks have reported a sharp fall in demand for business loans to its lowest level on record, likewise with home loan demand. However, the ECB remains determined to bring inflation back down to its 2% target, and that means a rate rise is still on the cards.
U.S. President Joe Biden's son, Hunter, has unexpectedly pleaded not guilty to tax and firearm charges after a judge refused to rubber stamp a plea deal with prosecutors. The unraveled agreement, negotiated over several weeks, would have seen Hunter Biden sentenced to 2 years of probation, pleaded guilty to tax charges, avoiding jail time. It was designed to end a 5-year investigation the Republicans have sought to use to politically harm his father. Biden's lawyers have been given 14 days to argue a new deal.